Hello, all, and welcome to Nature Connects. Nature Connects is Massachusetts TNC's webinar series that connects with scientists, experts, and influencers, and our partners from New England and around the world. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Massachusetts State Director and your host, Deb Markowitz. And here at the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts, we're dedicated to creating a healthier world for all. We work locally and globally using innovative science, scalable, long-lasting solutions to tackle the most complex environmental challenges facing our warming planet. We know what we do here in Massachusetts to protect nature will mean a better future for people and the planet. So we've got an exciting program for you today. We'll be chatting with acclaimed artist Sandy O'Connor and National Park Service cartographer and coastal geologist Mark Adams. In a unique collaboration between arts and sciences, Sandy and Mark have been working to use art to document the impacts of climate change along the coast of Cape Cod. I know many of you have been observing this yourself. You're going to hear from Sandy and Mark about how they started their work together and how art can be used as a vehicle to enhance environmental protection. You'll also get a first look at Sandy's newest artwork and a special invitation to her upcoming exhibit in Boston. So before we get started, I want to tell you a little bit about our guests. In the 90s and early 2000s, Sandy O'Connor worked at Bloomberg LP, rising to the position of Director of Creative Services. Then 9/11 came in New York City, and she began to think about pursuing an encore career in fine art. Today, Sandy is best known for her watercolors and the exquisite realism she achieves. You're going to see that for yourself. Her award-winning work has appeared in over 140 exhibitions and numerous publications. And in 2019, she was granted a prestigious Copley Society of Art Visual Artist Fellowship with a residency at the Historic Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown. Mark Adams has worked as a cartographer and coastal geologist for the National Park Service on Cape Cod since 1993. As a painter and a printmaker, he's shown at the Schoolhouse Gallery in P-Town since 1999. In 2017, he had an exhibition at the Provincetown Art Association Museum called Expedition Mark Adams, including a 30-foot artist seafloor map of the Gulf of Maine and a life-size model of Darwin's cabin from the HMS Beagle. As you think of questions for Sandy and Mark, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to them during the Q&A time. And I just want to thank you all again so much for joining us. And thank you, Sandy and Mark. And let's dive in. I think we're starting with Mark first.
Yes, hi, thanks, Deb. When Sandy came to me as an artist, I was very excited because I know the value that artists bring to our view of the landscapes and to the scientific work that we do. And Cape Cod National Seashore is very well staffed with science programs looking at long-term change and including climate change and sea level. And we're actually an outpost in seeing these changes as they occur. So I'm very lucky to be here using the equipment of modern GPS and satellite mapping to monitor change, but also to experience the world of artists like Sandy. Cape Cod National Seashore was created about 60 years ago in a world much different from today. And I don't know if we foresaw a lot of what would happen, but we preserved a lot of pristine landscapes, which you'll see, and we've actually worked a lot to restore them. I'm going to show a quick, let's see, share screen. I'm going to show a quick, just a Google Earth map of some of the sites that Sandy's painted and that she's going to talk about. And the first thing that you notice is that Cape Cod National Seashore is not just beaches, and one of our key resources are these estuarine systems that include salt marshes and wetlands, which play a primary role in the sites that Sandy selected. She'll tell you more about each one of these, and we'll have a little discussion about them. But many of these sites, including the Herring River in Wellfleet, the West End Marsh, Hatches Harbor, are sites where we have long-term restoration projects underway to bring back tidal flooding and restore habitats in these places. But like I said, I'm not going to go into them too much more, and we'll have plenty of time for questions to get in the details about these places. So I think I'm going to stop there and hand it over to Sandy, and we'll have an interaction as we go along. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it. I'm going to start by setting up my PowerPoint presentation right now for you, and I'll be sharing that with you in a second. Open that up. And I'll share the screen. There we go. Okay. So during my residency, I explored the impact of climate change on vulnerable landscapes within the Cape Cod National Seashore. And in turn, I used my art and social media platform to document their ecological importance. I completed a series of sketches, watercolor studies, and large watercolor landscape paintings. So I'd like to begin with a little bit of context and how I came to develop this body of work. As I was learning about climate change in coastal areas, I came across the current research of Professor Robin McInnes of the Coastal and Geotechnical Services Consultancy in Britain, and his work with watercolorworld.org. Watercolor World is a free online database of documentary watercolors painted before 1900. This database is intended to help scientists and environmentalists combat climate change by monitoring the evolution of the British coast. By the middle of the 18th century, British artists regularly sketched outdoors. Using portable watercolor paint boxes, they found a medium well suited to their needs, capable of capturing fleeting effects of light and weather. As you can see here, coastal scenes were a popular genre, and today they provide a valuable record of coastal conditions over time. So before the advent of photography, watercolor was used as a tool for documentation. And in many cases, proficiency was a prerequisite for employment in fields such as cartography, the military, mission work, the sciences, and surveying, to name a few. For example, in the United States, the famous artist James Whistler was a coast survey engraver, and the naturalist John Muir was a guide and artist on the epic Survey of the 39th Parallel across the Great Basin of Nevada and Utah. Prior to starting my residency, I had a general idea of what I wanted to do as it related to documenting vulnerable landscapes, but it wasn't easy without identifying specific locations. On the day I arrived in Provincetown, I emailed Brian Karlstrom, who is the superintendent of the Cape Cod National Seashore, because I had read an article about a talk he gave which addressed climate change issues. And within minutes, he emailed back with an introduction to Mark. Mark is also an accomplished artist and understood right away what it was I was trying to do. He showed me this long map of Cape Cod National Seashore, and with a red Sharpie, he was able to pinpoint specific locations for me to explore, which is how my project began. So at the top, you see Provincetown, Truro, Wellfleet, and Eastham. These are all towns that are considered to be encompassing into the outer Cape. And to the left is a list of the 8 spots that I actually put myself in, and ended up completing 8 finished works to complete the series. To illustrate my process for all the paintings that you're going to be seeing in this presentation, I'm going to begin with a watercolor of the Atlantic White Cedar Swamp in Wellfleet. But I'm going to illustrate here, you'll see for each of the locations I did some research in advance. I took photographs and made small sketches. And then back in the studio, I made color studies from those sketches to use as references for composing larger paintings. So here's an example of a graphite sketch in the lower left-hand corner. And these sketches were about 5 by 7. And then to the right, you're going to see the Atlantic White Cedar Swamp. I started with the Atlantic White Cedar Swamp because to me, it's the most ancient and the most unexpected landscape you might think of when you think of Cape Cod. This swamp is an isolated remnant of an ecosystem created after the last ice age. Over 50 years ago, the Job Corps installed a trail that descends into a stunted oak and pine forest, which leads to an elevated boardwalk. The park staff have continued to maintain it with substantial repairs completed last year. And on this afternoon, I had the trail to myself. It felt solemn and ancient. And at this particular spot, I was standing on the elevated boardwalk. The water below was still, shallow, and clear, and the bottom was packed with layers of golden brown leaves, some tinged with bright orange from the setting sun filtering through the cedar forest. So Mark, perhaps you'd like to say a few words about the forest?
Sure thing, Sandy. Thank you. Yeah, the thing about the White Cedar Swamp is it's a very unique habitat. The nearest other publicly accessible White Cedar Swamp is in Mashpee, so there's not that many of these. And it's really true. What you've captured here is that there's a completely different natural environment once you enter the swamp. You can be in the dunes, you can be in the sun, you can be in a excessively well-drained soil condition of most of the Cape. And then you enter this a completely different sphere of life where it's shaded, where it's wet. It's a unique habitat, and it's also one that has a lifespan. So we're looking carefully at regeneration and how to keep this place the same as it ever was.
Okay. Sorry. This is Hatches Harbor at Race Point in Provincetown. Hatches Harbor was once a 400-acre salt marsh. The dike I was standing on was originally installed in 1930 to lower the water level to eliminate standing water and breeding habitat for mosquitoes. The plan backfired because it blocked the flow of salt water and fish. In 1987, the Park Service initiated a program to restore the marsh, and the process of revitalization is happening. Pattern and color is what captivated me about this landscape. The repetition of rounded shapes in the sand formed by tidal flows and an elegant complementary palette of oranges and blues enhance the composition. Big puffy clouds above, the fresh green grasses below complete the scene.
Yeah, that's, I'll just throw in a couple of comments that this is one of the first places that we did a restoration project, and we've increased the salt marsh area here by reintroducing the tides. It's a big open sky. It's a big open sky area, and that's what walkers and visitors here notice first. It's also a massive staging and roosting and nesting area for shorebirds. So great bird watching site. And yeah, and we know how popular it is, and you've captured the feeling of the flats.
Yeah, so Mark, you also mentioned that the color of the sand is so different. It's so orange, and you
Right.
said that and that's because of the rust content, or
Yeah,
sorry,
actually,
the iron.
yeah, that's iron. That's it's a fairly pristine habitat. So these colors and things are natural occurrences based on sediments. Provincetown is the tail end of the reworking of the marine sediments that are taken away from the coastal bluffs in Wellfleet and Truro and deposited here. And it's very new, has very shallow aquifers and lots of these mineral deposits that are collected here by wave action.
Okay. This is Fort Hill at Nauset Marsh in Eastham. Fort Hill was the highest point adjacent to a meeting house erected by Pilgrim residents of Nauset, later called Eastham, shortly after they settled the area in 1644. Within 30 years of settlement, the Eastham forests were cleared of all trees and became the Eastham Plains. Only at Fort Hill was there any semblance of soil. Dairy farming continued here until the 1940s, and now a forest creeps in. But as depicted in my painting, the pastures are still kept open as a reminder of yesteryear. And during changeable weather, Fort Hill might be the best place on Cape Cod to witness the high drama of sea, clouds, wind, and marsh as they ride into deep fall. This is a popular lookout spot for visitors, and I've been there a dozen times through the years in all seasons. It's a panorama of big sky with open meadows rolling down to Nauset Marsh. Far out in the distance is a barrier beach with a rowdy inlet to the Atlantic Ocean.
I love that word rowdy for the inlet, and it is a very dynamic inlet. This is one of the cultural landscapes of the Cape Cod National Seashore, and that's in the sense that for most of our landscapes, we have the mandate to allow nature to take its course. But here we've tried to maintain the feeling of the agricultural fields that Sandy mentioned through mowing. We can't do the same work that grazing animals and real life farming would do to maintain a rural landscape, but we still have the vistas. And our former superintendent, George Price, always said that this was his favorite place to go and contemplate and kind of relieve the pressures that come from managing 44,000 acres for the public.
It's wonderful. It's a beautiful trail. This is Pilgrim Heights, overlooking Pilgrim Springs Salt Meadow in North Truro. There is archaeological evidence that for at least 5,000 years, this area was chosen by ancient inhabitants as a favorable place to live because there was access to fresh water, as well as food sources and protection due to its elevation and forests. Early European settlers tried to live off the land here as well until it was overcleared and the soil could no longer support farming, after which the landscape began to recover. This view has all the elements of a classic Cape Cod landscape: meadow, marsh, pond, dune, blue ocean, and sky. I'm sounding like Stefan from Saturday Night Live here, but that day was very windy and clear. Tinges of gold and burnt sienna in the high grasses and meadows were a harbinger of another autumn to come.
Beautiful. Yeah, so High Head actually was the terminus of Cape Cod when the glaciers retreated. And as of about 6,000 years ago, when sea levels rose after the glacial retreat, this was the end of Cape Cod. There was nothing. You could stand on the top of High Head and just look at ocean all around you. The whole Province on Hook grew from sand spits that accumulated off the end of High Head. High Head is also, as Sandy pointed out, it was heavily used, and there's lots of ancient archaeological sites there. And it's because of that use, it has remnant heathland grassland areas, open landscapes. It's also known as one of the great hawk watching sites on Cape Cod seasonally. So we all love it.
Speaking of High Head, this is High Head Dunes, overlooking East Harbor in North Truro. Historically, salt marshes were impaired because roads and railroads, such as the track built in 1910 along East Harbor, and eventually Route 6 were built through them, which cut off the saltwater inundation that is necessary to maintain their ecosystems. If you look at this, you'll see this stretch of land, and you can see these little peaks that look like little houses. That's the spot that I'm referring to. Right there is where the original railroad was built in 1910. And in front of that is East Harbor. Behind that is Cape Cod Bay. And of course, beyond that is Provincetown. Today, East Harbor is a tidal estuary, which continually flushes and provides nourishment and habitat for many species of marine plant and animal life. The salt meadows within the system slow down the impact of severe weather occurrence, which is happening at a more rapid rate than ever before. After climbing one of the highest dunes at High Head, I was rewarded with this panoramic view. It was breathtaking. East Harbor and Cape Cod were laying in front of me, with Provincetown and the iconic Pilgrim Monument in the distance, the Atlantic Ocean to my right, and the High Head Cliffs were behind me. The late afternoon sunlight was blinding and made the atmosphere hazy. Violet shadows draped across long stretches of warm pink sand.
Great. Yeah, this is actually the view northward, just beyond Pilgrim Springs, which was the last view. And this is the area that I was talking about that would have been just pure water, just pure open ocean 6,000 years ago. All of these dunes and sand were accumulated later through the action of waves. And these dunes that Sandy talks about they kind of give you a sense of human scale and really how small we are, because these are like a half-mile wide parabolic dunes that are wind-driven. It's a phenomenon you see in dunelands all over the world, where the prevailing winds create these big, stark shapes. And let's see. Also, this what Sandy refers to with the houses is called Beach Point, even though it's no longer a point. Now it's the primary highway access. But the place we're standing on was the route of the stagecoach line that Thoreau would have taken when he traveled here in the mid 1800s and wrote his Cape Cod lectures.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of these spots have changed their names over time because the actual landforms have changed, I think, and with generations, things they get called different things. So East Harbor was originally Pilgrim Lake, correct?
Actually, East Harbor is the ancient name. When it was a harbor, as you pointed out, ships could shelter here. And Pilgrim Springs, it may be a little ironic, but Pilgrim Springs was tacked onto it in maybe the 1930s as kind of an attractive real estate name.
Okay.
To come and buy your house in a place where the pilgrims wash their clothes. But actually, that was a later name tacked on. And there were shoebox size lots put all over the top of High Head at that time that now are just consolidated into national park land.
Okay. Well, this is a perfect segue into the next one, talking about real estate. Well, this is the signature piece that is actually, it's actually probably my most favorite out of the whole series. This is Ballston Beach at the Overwash in Truro on the day after Hurricane Dorian blew through. At this site in 1891, a New Yorker, Sheldon Ball, constructed the Ballston Beach Inn, which became a colony complete with cottages, a bowling alley, and a community building which had a dining room and a ballroom. The inn attracted primarily New York clientele who stayed for the entire summer season, many of whom returned over a period of 5 generations. The cottages were moved 7 times because of erosion of the bluff. In the 60s, Ballston Beach became part of the Cape Cod National Seashore, and the last of the cottages was taken down in 1970. Since then, and up until Dorian, overwashes from storms have been recorded at least 5 times, with seawater mixing with the freshwater marsh system. I was 1 week into my residency when, during the early hours of Saturday morning, September 7th, 2019, Hurricane Dorian brushed by the Cape and Islands on its way up the coast to Canada. On the next day, I was able to visit the overwashed section at Ballston Beach. I had a front row seat to witness the aftermath of the storm. Seawater from the ocean had receded, leaving a dramatic moonscape covered with debris, foam, and piles of sand. The sun was setting as thunderous waves pounded the beach. A heavy mist rose above the overwash and into the atmosphere, bathing everything in a pale gold light.
This is a great spot to put yourself in the time machine. And the story that Sandy points out about 1891, the original summer cottage colony that was built here would have been now as much as a mile out to sea as the shoreline eroded. A lot of the erosion is natural, and it's part of the wave action that feeds the sand deposits in the north end of the Cape. So, Sheldon and his people might have experienced a beach like this, only in a different place farther out. Although with these big storms that seem to be becoming more common in these overwashes, they do 2 things. One, they actually replenish sand to the back barrier marsh system. They deliver sand there and elevate the platform of the marsh so that it can keep up with sea level rise. But under normal conditions, there'd be enough quiet time for a new dune to build. And since the last series of overwashes into 2013, we haven't had time for that dune to build. So we're waiting to see what the pattern of weather will be and whether it's permanently changed or just a local or a
Okay.
recent phenomenon.
This is the Herring River at Chequasit Neck Road Dike in Wellfleet. Historically, the Herring River supported a vibrant coastal river ecosystem and one of the largest nurseries for commercial and recreational fisheries in the Gulf of Maine. It encompasses nearly 1,000 acres and over 6 miles of waterways. Wellfleet town reports from the late 1800s indicate that more than 200,000 river herring were netted annually from the river. The ecosystem was dramatically altered in 1909 when efforts to control mosquitoes resulted in the construction of a dike across the river's mouth at Chequasit Neck. This had devastating effects at the time. It is currently one of the largest tidally restricted estuaries in the northern United States. For over the last 10 years, significant efforts have been ongoing by numerous partners to restore the river. Despite standing on a culvert on a busy road and hearing the sound of water gushing below me, the view was quite serene, looking across what is known as the Gut towards Great Island Trail. A beautiful sky reflected shades of blue and violet on the sand spit rising from the shallows as white foam bounced on the surface of the water.
Great. Yeah, this is a really great example of how the watercolorist art creates these flat plains that describe the flats. And what part of what Sandy's describing about the fragile nature of these salt marshes, this is outside of the dike near a place called the Gut. And just a few centimeters difference in the elevation of the tides every day determines whether or not salt marsh plants can survive. And so I've spent a lot of time, knee deep in this marsh, surveying elevations and looking at the extent of salt marsh to see, along with our science colleagues, whether it can survive with as as sea level rises by the centimeter over the marsh.
Okay. And this is Long Point Dike at West End Marsh in Provincetown. Long Point Dike, also known as the Breakwater, was constructed in 1910 to prevent Provincetown Harbor from flooding, but in fact, over time, it's done the opposite. The West End Marsh is one of the prettiest, pristine marshes on the Cape. The dike created a substantial hydraulic impediment that acts as a physical barrier to larger fish and invertebrates that would otherwise inhabit a fully functioning estuarine ecosystem. It's also a bit of an attractive nuisance with well-documented stories of people falling between the rocks and getting stranded at high tide. But I chose this image to close the series because it's the only man-made structure I painted. The massive scale of such a historic man-made structure, literally trying to stem the tide of a natural occurrence, was intriguing. I could plainly see the contrasting ecosystems on either side of the dike. Trauma is baked in with strong line, form, and movement.
Really beautiful. It's interesting that if we classify all the submerged habitats and the intertidal habitats of the Outer Cape, this unnatural rocky feature is our only rocky intertidal type. So there are species here, both seaweed and animals that thrive in a rocky environment. As Sandy pointed out, it's, people love this spot, and, it creates a swimming pool effect because the tide's out of phase as it traps the water behind it. But one very interesting, there's all these effects that you never imagine. And one effect is that the small crabs, the short crabs, have been undermining the salt marsh by eating the grasses and the stems and allowing it to decay because there's no large fish that can get in there and be predators on the marsh crabs. That's at least one of the reasons we think that we're losing salt marsh in the West End behind this breakwater. Bravo.
Thank you. Well, that concludes my slideshow of my paintings, and I just want to close with this favorite quote of mine: "The most beautiful experience we can have is the mysterious. It is the fundamental emotion which stands at the cradle of true art and true science," by Albert Einstein. So thank you. And thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Cindy.
Well, thank you both. What a wonderful quote to end on. And Sandy, your artwork is just fabulous. Just
Thank
so
you.
realistic, and it just evokes so much emotion. I would bet that we have a lot of people on watching, and I bet they've really are impressed. And it was so interesting to hear Mark talk about really what's going on in the area and a little bit of the history from you and description. And it was, I can't wait. I'm going to the Cape for a couple of weeks for vacation at the end of the month. And I just can't wait to get there and see all these places again. It really is thrilling. There's a lot of, we have a few questions, some about specific things and some about your collaboration. And I am really fascinated about how the arts and sciences can intersect, and how in doing so, it really helps raise awareness about how we can and should be protecting our planet. And I have a few questions just to start us off. First, Sandy, have you always been passionate about the environment? And
Well, okay.
and also, how did the idea that art could be used to raise awareness of climate change come to you? Because it seems like a pretty unique passion for an artist.
Yeah, I've always been kind of torn between the two worlds of art and science. I declared to my parents when I was young that I wanted to be an artist, and they were sort of, you need a backup plan,
You need a real job, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think I talk to many artists, and I hear that refrain over and over. But I was also really good in school, and I love science. And so I thought, okay, well, I'm going to major in biology when I go to college. And so I went to a local college up in North Jersey. I actually grew up on a small farm there, which is where my love for the outdoors was really kindled at a very, very young age. We had woods and swamps and ponds, and it was just an idyllic childhood, actually. But fast forward to college, when I tried to sign up for classes my freshman year, I got closed out of all the biology classes. And the only classes I could take in the sciences were environmental sciences. Earth Day had just started 3 years earlier, which was a new movement at the time. So I said, okay, well, I'm going to fulfill my requirements. And then I've just opened up this whole world. Because from there, I discovered environmental design. We had a speaker come and speak to us, and then I found out about the landscape architecture program at Rutgers. So I transferred out of the small local college I was in and went to Rutgers and graduated with a formal degree in landscape architecture.
How did that get you to Bloomberg, though? That does.
Well, okay. So there's a little bit of landscape archecture. It's an all-encompassing field, and you have to be proficient in graphic design and at the time photography. And you have to know how to present and speak, and sell something, right? So I got very good at that. But, part of me didn't care about the engineering part. I didn't care if things got built. I just wanted to draw them on paper,
That was a good discovery, right?
Yeah. And that eventually led to a stint as a technical illustrator, which led to me getting another degree in commercial art, which then opened the world of advertising and marketing to me. So that's how it all snowballed. I know, it's a strange, weird.
So passion for the nature and the environment, thinking about maybe going to environmental sciences, but then ending up.
And then sold out. I sold out.
I know you sold out because you ended up in the right spot. And this is a great story for all the young people on who are watching, because life is a journey, right? You might start in one place and end up in a completely different place.
Absolutely, and I met my husband. He was a landscape architecture major, and he also graduated from Harvard with his graduate degree in graphic design. Actually, today's our anniversary. We got
Happy anniversary.
Yes, thank you. We graduated June 2nd and got married on June 3rd.
Wow.
So
that was the way it used to be done.
Shout out to Steve. Yeah.
So, Mark, the same question could apply to you, like all the same questions, because in addition to being an accomplished scientist, you're also an artist. kind of in the flip way, your main gig is as a scientist, but you've had lots of exhibits and as a tell us about your passion for art, how it connects to your love of science. How did you get here?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the question. And it's funny, one message I like to send out to everybody is don't listen if they try to discourage you from what you love. But I really didn't take any art classes until I finished college, because I was good at science. But I did go to landscape architecture school. I don't know if we talked about that, Sandy. I guess we did. But yeah, I have a degree.
I knew.
Also.
Interesting.
And that gave me a lot of insights into how to read the landscape. And you can do that with maps and satellite imagery and GPS. But it's one thing I'd really like to say, because I know a lot of the listeners out there are nature, not just nature lovers, but they go on their own expeditions and treks. And I really feel as a scientist that your observations can be really significant, no matter what level of training you have. If you do a sketch, if you keep a journal, those are real-time, firsthand observations. And the more you do that, I love anyone who keeps a weather journal. If someone has a weather journal and they've done that for 10 years, that's extremely valuable local information that nobody else has. So your point of view as a scientist or an artist is real information.
I left out a little chunk there. While I was my senior year at Rutgers, I actually got an internship with the Department of Energy, and I worked on environmental impact statements as a landscape architecture and a writer. And so I was exposed to a lot of other scientists, and that was my job was to work on uranium mining and milling projects out west, and to research ways to reclaim the land to not its former state, but to a different state.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess as we're thinking about climate change, and I know at TNC we do a lot of restoration and conservation, and with climate change, we're actually, really at the cutting edge of thinking about restoration from the context of, how do we build resilience on the landscape so it can withstand the changes that are coming? Like if we restore it to its past state, it may not actually be able to withstand, the changes, the new weather, the warmer weather, the more water. And so we really, the past is not precedent anymore. I wonder, Mark, you've been studying climate change on Cape Cod for a while now. What changes have you seen over the years to the coastline? Are you optimistic that we can stave off the impacts of climate change? Does restoration play a role in that, like the kind of work that we're doing at TNC?
The most important piece of advice is to know the changes and to roll with it. Resiliency is sort of this magic word nowadays. And I think resiliency works best when systems are functioning at their full, robust, all the ecological services of tides and all of the web linkages between the trophic levels of plants and animals, pollination, that timing and stuff. If it's an undisturbed landscape, restoration is so important in bringing back natural systems so that they can be resilient against climate change. But the fact is that change is inevitable. These changes are inevitable. I think we're in a sweet spot though here for people because we have abundant water supply. We may see many changes ecologically. So again, I just go back to science. The better science we have, the more we can predict and understand the changes.
Yeah, that really makes sense. There's so much to learn. I really appreciated your comment about the role, not just of citizen scientists, but just observers. And I know, as we, are really tracking the changes from climate change, we do rely on those old weather journals that farmers used to keep, and to know just, what's blooming when, how has it changed over time, and Yeah.
Right, yeah, it speaks to the
Sorry.
history that I started with, when you saw all those old paintings that were done
That's
in
right.
Britain. I mean, that's a really big deal. If people can go on watercolorworld.org, watercolor OUR in Britain, and it's really fascinating what this Dr. McGinnis is doing, working with that organization. But my work, with all the technological advances that are being done today, my work isn't intended to be a metric tool for data collection.
Right.
My work is intended to serve as sort of a gentle reminder of the beauty that exists in most of the vulnerable landscapes and ecosystems, and why they're so important to monitor and protect before they vanish forever. That was the crux and the whole intent of my body of work. So.
That is just so beautifully said. I really appreciate that. Mark, you wanted to add something?
I want to throw in something since you mentioned citizen science. We have a really great example of that. We installed a shed on the cliff in Truro for wave observations, and we have actually one couple has kind of like adopted this project, and for more than 10 years they go out 3 times a week and count waves, basically, and estimate wave height and wave direction. And this tells us lots about, because they're consistent observers, it's a very simple observation to count waves for 60 seconds and estimate their height, but it tells us which direction the currents are going, where the sand's moving. And it's just an example of consistency bringing real information. And it's also, the other thing I want to say about that is a lot of the climate change effects are very subtle. So these changes in the dominant wave direction are a result of a few feet of sea level rise over Georges Bank, which is 100 miles away. But as sea level rises over Georges Bank, then the Cape is exposed to waves from the open ocean and more wave energy, meaning faster erosion.
I didn't realize that that intersection was, you could see it already. Let me note for folks that in the chat, there's a whole bunch of resources that were added in by Liz, one of my colleagues, and including National Park Service resources on Cape Cod seashore and access to trails, a free ebook on coastal landforms. There's information about Sandy's work. So just take a look in the chat. And I want to get Frank Mand. He's part of an environmental organization on the Cape, focused on the rare Massachusetts coastal Pine Barrens ecoregion. And he says that he's most intrigued by the chronicling of the changes as done by the British organization that was mentioned, that you just mentioned again. Can we hear about how that effort can be facilitated by your work and any other efforts underway in this area?
Well, there is a link to the website watercolorworld.org to get more information on this. Right now, there isn't actually. I actually did speak to some folks at the Provincetown Art Museum about that, and I've talked to other people, but you sort of get a sort of, huh? What, I mean, something like that exists, and it's actually funded by Prince Charles and Camilla Bowles. Yeah, they're backing. Watercolor is probably a bigger deal over there. It's such an old art form, that it's here in the United States. For some reason, it's sort of, there's a hierarchy. And I think that's all been established by galleries over the years. In England and Britain, my mom's from Scotland, by the way. So that's why I have this other really close, and my dad's from England. So I had once I saw that, I was just, oh, my people. I was brought up with that sort of sensibility, and I visited there, and I understand how important that art form is. So, but you'd have to go on to the website to get more information on that.
That's great. Hey, so we've got, yes, feel free to jump in.
I can add one thing. Photography actually works the same way, and if you don't mind, I want to share one picture on the screen here.
Nice.
Let's see here. So this is part of a project that I did in the 90s where we went to archives to find old photographs of sites, of landscape sites in Cape Cod. This is Stone Rock in Eastham. And then I rephotographed the same view in the 90s. We could go and do that again today. But I would bet that many people who've been coming to the Cape, you know, for decades have old photographs and could put together pairs like this that actually show scientifically how the landscape has changed. You know, there are archives, let's see, the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, the archives and museums provide great resource. But I bet you guys, some of your people have photographs of their own that they could create these kind of comparisons to show change.
And that rock, Mark, is that glacial?
Yeah, that's a
lava?
glacial erratic, one of the
Erratic.
largest
Oh,
glacial
interesting.
erratics in Eastham. There's a picnic area there on that you can visit.
Oh, interesting. So we've got a few questions from Glenn Dunkley, and I'll just put them all together. And I think they're really for you, Mark. First, what's the elevation of Cape Cod? He's guessing erosion is a major issue. What's the Cape doing to save its shorelines? And how much of the shoreline is lost each year?
Okay, so there's a couple of different coastal change regimes, and one is the coastal glacial bluffs. And actually the highest points on the outer Cape are right at the edge of those bluffs. The whole Cape is tilted from east to west. The whole outer Cape is tilted from east to west. It's a great plain that was created between lobes of the glaciers. And so it's the peak of that tilted plain is eroding about 3 to 5 feet per year in those glacial areas. So there's some high points. I go running and there's a high point I run to that's about 140 feet above the ocean. As that recedes, the high point will be somewhere else. The other kinds of changes that are happening are on the barrier beaches and marshes, and those are much more dynamic. The glacial stuff, as it retreats, we won't get any more of it until there's another glaciation. But the barrier beaches are the way to address coastal change is to allow those beaches to allow the sand processes to take place. Don't block the sand. Anytime there's a artificial hard structure built on the beach, it's going to impede the flow of sand. It's a river that flows along the shoreline and feeds the beaches. So as much as that can operate naturally, the better off everybody's going to be.
Oh, that's
You can thank my brother for that question.
There you go.
Good.
Inside
Good question. Good question.
It's I'm finding the answer intriguing because I know at the Nature Conservancy we think a lot about rivers and river health and how you take out the you make sure that you're removing dams and so forth and reconnecting rivers to their floodplains so that you don't have the kind of erosion that creates the terrible flooding events, the erosive flood events. So it's not the different.
It's ironic, but erosion is a natural resource. The sand that is produced by erosion is a natural resource and it's in short supply. It's used up to its extent. So if you try to stop erosion, then basically you're starving the beaches of sand. So we consider erosion, even if our land's eroding and other adjacent lands are getting the sand, that's a valuable natural resource we're providing.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden the restaurant falls in. I remember that happening in Wellfleet, right? The whole dune collapsed, and
one thing I sorry to interrupt. One thing I was reading through my research too was that when you try to take sand from someplace else and bring it to another location and thinking you're doing good, and you're remediating, that's the composition of that sand that you took from someplace else and moved it to another part of the Cape, or, it's not going to work because the composition is so different. I mean, am I right about that, Mark? I mean,
very true. Yes, that's right. In fact, sometimes the towns will move sand temporarily around a beach, but it only works if you take local sand from local beaches.
Well, that's interesting. So Linda Jones has a follow-up question. We're seeing dramatic barrier beach erosion here on the Vineyard. How do the Cape and Islands impact each other's erosion or health, environmental health? Is there a symbiosis?
Well, not exactly. The systems work the same. And so each, they divide these rivers of sand into units they call cells, where there's a source of the sand at one end and a sink at the other. So on the Cape, the sand's coming from Eastham and Wellfleet, and it's going towards this sink where it's dropped off in Provincetown. But anywhere where you see a spit, a sand spit, that's like a big arrow on the map that's pointing the direction of that sand cell. So the spit is growing because of the upstream supply of sand. So, the south shore of the vineyard, for example, the sand is moving eastwards to create that South Beach connection between Chappaquiddick and mainland there, Katama Plains. But those cells can be large or small, but it's very important to look at the direction of waves, direction of flow, and not to block it.
Interesting. Okay. There was a question from Beth Blanchard. Could the chat be made savable so we can easily use the links that have been shared? And just know that we're going to be sending out an email after this in the next week or so, which will include all of the links. So if you haven't been able to get them now, don't worry about it. You'll get it in a follow-up email. Ann Mullins asks a question to Mark. She knows that you do a lot of work with local school kids. Can you address the importance of taking kids out to talk about the environment and art and the connections, especially as this is the world those children will inherit?
That question answers itself in a way. Yes, I actually have been working as a mentor in the school system here in the Cape for decades. And I'm currently working with some middle schoolers doing a climate change project. And it's kind of inspiring to see the questions they ask and their logic, and they're really ruthless in their logic about what we can do. So that's always been a great thing. But, I think we're all in agreement that there's a change that happens to your brain when you get outside under the sky. And when you take kids out, I took kids for an after-school program into the dunes, and a few of them just started running for the horizon, like uncontrollably. They couldn't stop. There was this sense of freedom, and I just love seeing that. So the more we are outside, the more we will understand and be taught by our kids.
I also have this strong feeling that, we only love the things we know. We only protect the things we love, right? And but we only love the things we actually experience and know from our experience. And so getting out, getting kids outside, getting everyone outside actually is the way you create the next generation of environmental advocates.
And I think this past year proved that, by the way, all of us.
Absolutely.
I mean, people we're literally running for the hills and finding, those places that were restorative, and that could, make them feel freer, because we were being also contained for such a long time for the pandemic.
So at TNC, we think a lot about that and its overlay with environmental justice and equity, right? You think about,
yes,
we all feel so blessed because we had access to nature, and yet so many people in Massachusetts and beyond were stuck in cement, in little apartments and without the green space. And we really are blessed, those of us who've had access to the outdoors, and we need to dedicate ourselves really to making sure that everyone has that benefit. Go ahead.
Just one comment about equity. I was asked to do an environmental mural about the marine ecosystem. And one thing that it took me a few minutes to realize that people are part of this ecosystem. But when you refer to that, what is the ecological web of the marine system? For thousands of years, it was Native Americans. And the Native Americans in southeastern New England were a navigational people. They were a maritime people. They populated all these areas with dugout canoes and their own navigation methods for thousands of years before our history began. So I just think that has to go on the map and in the diagram of the ecology of this place.
Yeah. So listen, we're heading towards the end. I want to note there's a lovely comment from Samantha Polaro. She said, I'm working to reclaim our neighborhood association's riparian area and beach dune from invasive species. Many people find nature unattractive, nature in quotes, unattractive, like native staghorn, sumac, pokeweed. Many years ago, I saw these plants in the same bad light. I found that pastoral landscapes from artists, such as those from the Hudson River School, taught me that many textures of these plants are beautiful. Any recommendations on how I can teach people how to see nature as beauty through art? I'm considering instructing groups at the beach to paint small landscapes, including the uglies. And so I think that might be a great final question before we begin to wrap up. Any thoughts? I think that's exactly what this is all about, right? Helping link people to passion, for nature, to see nature as beauty.
Well, botanical art is a good place to start, I think, there with that. There are classes everywhere, for that type of thing. And so you can go online. YouTube is a big resource as well. And that's, finding something you love, even if it's in your backyard or in a meadow, or just taking your sketchbook and going out and just doing it, just practice.
I'll just say that, Sandy, that's something that you do very well, is the way to see these uglies, or these sort of minor players in our romantic idea of nature, is to see them for their function, to see what they do in nature. And so your paintings bring it all together, in that every element of the landscape is important to create that scene. So
well, thank you very much. So I guess I do want to just plug this show at the Copley Society of Art in Boston downtown. It starts June 17th, and you'll be able to see all the paintings that you saw in this presentation.
And you're going to be there on the 17th?
I'm going to be there on the 17th. There is no formal reception due to COVID, but people are permitted in the gallery, masked. What else can I say? The paintings are 24 by 28. They're large. They're beautifully custom framed, but alongside will be those sketches framed that you saw in the presentation, as well as a small study, watercolor color studies that I did in the studio before I actually went on to the larger paintings.
That's great. Any final word from you, Mark?
Yeah, I just will say again, go out and be an observer, be a sketcher, and be a scientist, and trust your observations and use them as your guide through your trek.
That's wonderful. And I apologize to everyone whose questions I didn't get to. There were some very specific questions about some of the art and what was in some of the pictures. So go to the Copley show to ask your questions directly. I encourage you to do that. And there was a lot more questions about the flows and erosion on Cape Cod, and do feel free to reach out to Mark. We'll provide all of their information on this in the follow-up email. So I just want to thank you all for joining us today. Really, thank you to our speakers. Really wonderful conversation. We really appreciate you taking your time with us, and thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in, also for your support of the Nature Conservancy. It is your support that makes all of this work possible. And again, we will be sending up a follow-up email over the coming days. In addition to links to the resources we talked about today, we'll also have a recording of the webinar. And if you're enjoying these webinars, or this one in particular, please share them with your friends. You can follow us on social media at conserve_MA on Facebook and on Instagram to keep up with our work and to get updates on upcoming virtual opportunities to connect. As always, you can see our upcoming webinars and sign up at nature.org/MA webinars. I want to thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you again all.
Thank you very much. Delighted.
Thank you.